Hey guys, it's Cody with Fiveable today, and we are going to be talking about agricultural practices. I was looking at the poll, and I'm looking at it now, and some of you say that you don't feel confident on this, and some of you say that you need to review a couple things and ask some questions, which is perfect. If I hope you guys are having a great night so far. In the chat, let me know of any questions that you have during the live stream, any concerns, anything that you might be confused about, anything like that. One thing I did want to mention, I listed some important links that go along with this slide on PowerPoint, this live stream. I have the slides that I'm going off of, the AP Environmental CED, which tells you guys exactly what you need to learn so you guys can get that 5 on your exam. And finally, the Fiveable community for AP Environmental Science. This is the one for our live stream. Feel free to comment any questions that you have there after the live stream. I hope that sounds good with everyone. All right, so before we get started, be sure to follow Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, just to stay in the know about anything with AP Environmental Science or any other AP courses that you guys are taking this year. As you guys know, Fiveable is now free, which I'm glad because you guys got all the resources, and that will be very beneficial for you guys. All right, so in this live stream in particular, we're going to be talking about clear cutting, the Green Revolution, and impacts of agricultural practices on the environment. All right, so first is clear cutting. If you guys can't see the slides or something doesn't work, just let me know in the chat as well as we're going along. So clear cutting basically is whenever you clear all the trees in an area, which there's a picture in the corner there, all the trees are gone. They usually do patches, like they won't do an entire forest, but this is a big problem in rainforests and stuff like that, that process carbon dioxide that we release into the atmosphere. It's a large industry. I'm guessing you guys use a lot of paper in school. This is where it comes from, clear cutting all the wood and then making it into paper. Construction, you need a lot of timber. All those different kinds of things is what is leading to this clear cutting. It is the reason why clear cutting is such a popular way or common way of doing it is because it's efficient. If you went through, and there's other methods where you might cut down a row of trees and then skip a couple rows and cut another row of trees, that takes a lot more work. But whenever you clear cut, it's a lot more efficient. So that's why it's a common way of clearing land and gathering timber. There are a lot of negative impacts to the environment from this method. We have things such as more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, runoff, streams. Remember that whenever you think of clear cutting and forests, think about streams because they're impacted in a lot of ways by clear cutting. Anybody have any questions on clear cutting and what it is? Let me know in the chat. Or if you have any questions on anything that we've covered so far or anything you want me to cover, be sure to include it in the chat. Okay, so now we know what clear cutting is, chopping down all the trees in an area or patch. So now it's time to look at the impacts that this can have on the environment. So the first one is soil degradation. And what you're going to notice as we go through this live stream is that a lot of the different agricultural practices that we put in place cause soil degradation. Once we start messing with natural resources, then we start to mess with soil and its fertility and its ability to grow plants. So one way that clear cutting impacts soil is you have an increased chance of soil erosion. I'm not sure if any of you have done this experiment, but in a lab or something, but if you have a tub of soil and you have a lot of plants in it and you tilt it, like if it's in a train, you tilt it, the soil is less likely to run down. Especially even if you add water, plants and their roots, they're holding that soil there, which helps decrease soil erosion, and the topsoil being taken away. So it's more solid whenever there's roots in it. However, when we cut down all these trees, the roots start to decay and rot, and we don't have that stuff holding in the soil anymore. So we get a lot of extra runoff, and this runoff and erosion, and which eventually this erosion and runoff eventually leads to soil being infertile and unable to support plants, because as this water is running through the soil, it's also washing away the nutrients, which can be another very big negative impact. So next we're going to go to stream disruption, which I said was a big thing about clear cutting. First, we have decreased water clarity. So whenever you have soil and it's running off, it's eroding, and it's all getting into the soil, and then we start seeing the water get real cloudy and filled with dirt. So what negative impact, in the chat, you can just answer this really quick. What negative impact could that have if we have sediment and eroded soil getting into our streams? What could be a negative impact? In the chat, anybody? If you need me to repeat the question, then I would be happy to do so. Okay. So I don't think anyone's going to respond. But so basically, when we start getting this muddy soil, yes, that can be one thing with runoff. Yes. Another thing that happens as well is fish are unable to breathe. Plants are less likely to grow because they can't get sunlight. Algae is less likely to grow. And we sort of kind of get all the vegetation and organisms now can't live in the habitat that they call home, which is a big problem. And then again, like we said, and then another thing is whenever a stream is running through a forest, the trees are providing shade for this stream, which keeps it cold. If any of you live in the mountains or near mountains and you go to like a trout stream or something like that, you realize the water is really cold. However, when we don't have this form of shade and all this extra runoff, then the water temperature starts to warm up. And this can lead to very bad things. Again, we have fish dying and not being able to survive because the water temperature is higher than what they can withstand, as well as algal blooms and bacteria are more likely to grow in the water whenever it's warmer. We could see parasites that might grow more often, impacting fish. We might see just basically bacteria. The water becomes unhealthy to drink, so even humans are being impacted by this as well. And then one thing that's also important here when talking about organisms that live in an environment and how they are able to survive is the fact that whenever the water starts to get muddy and the temperature starts to get higher, the dissolved oxygen goes down. And if you don't know what dissolved oxygen is oxygen that is essentially dissolved in water. This is how fish breathe, and underwater organisms get oxygen. So if we have less of that in the water, then our habitat stream is less likely and less able to provide oxygen. And then increased runoff. Another one we've mentioned, better chances of localized flooding, because now we have just a stream. All the water that would have been absorbed by the tree roots is now just running into the stream. So the current's now getting faster. It's filling with sediment and all these other chemicals, which is not good at all. And we have fish dying and bacteria growing in the water. And then we have increase in pollutants and runoff. So Rebecca, this is when you talked about eutrophication. This fertilizer that might be used once the farmers chop down all these trees, then we're going to start having eutrophication and nutrients. Eutrophication is basically whenever nitrogen and fertilizer get into the water. So now this algae now has fertilizer and warm water, and basically an algal bloom is most likely to happen, which can definitely harm fish, and they're already suffering because there's a whole bunch of sediment in the water. So if you can see, this sort of kind of like a feedback loop. Like one thing happens, which causes another thing to happen, which just makes it worse and worse. And that's sort of kind of how I would recommend thinking about these, is thinking of like this causes this, and I'll help you remember. And another thing, greater air pollution. Trees are a great way of absorbing or provide a great service to our environment by taking in CO2. So whenever we chop them down, yeah, they don't do that anymore. So we have all the CO2 in the air and no trees to take it in, which is a big problem. And of course, that leads to climate change. And like I said here, we have a positive feedback loop. Okay, so we have trees taking in CO2 and turning them into oxygen, and then we cut them down, and they can't take in CO2 anymore, and so there's more CO2 in the air. And then with more CO2 in the air, then the temperature gets warmer with climate change. And then after the thing gets warmer, then bacteria is more likely to grow, and actually trees get diseases. Trees get diseases. And so we have more bacteria killing more trees, which means less trees, more CO2, warmer temperatures, and it's just a positive feedback loop. So yeah, that's why it's such a big problem, because we're just going to chop trees down and it's only this little patch, we're good. No, but then we have this feedback loop that impacts the entire forest and organisms that we never thought it would impact. And like I said in the PowerPoint, and like it is in the PowerPoint, higher average temperatures mean more trees die. So you might clear cut one patch, but then more trees die after that, which is very sad. Any questions about the effects of clear cutting? Anything maybe you didn't understand, you want me to explain one more time? I'd be happy to do it. I'm here for you guys, to help you guys out. So if you have any questions, let me know. All right, so now we're going on to the Green Revolution. So the best way for me to describe the Green Revolution is describing the transition from our traditional way of growing plants and crops to a more modern way. So traditionally, we just have, you're growing a variety of crops at a farm, less pollution, and then we have a more modern way. So I broke this down into 4 main parts. So the first part is genetically modified crops or plants, and then we have increased water usage, irrigation, fertilizer, mechanization, and there's one more. Hold on, I took some notes here. And the use of fertilizer, pesticides, and the increased number of crop yields. So that's how this is broken down. So first we have genetically modified plants, also known as GMOs. And the thing about GMOs is they're fairly new. So basically they're genetically modified. So you might want to genetically modify plants so that they can survive certain temperatures. They might be able to survive certain pests. They might be able to survive certain weather conditions. All these different kinds of things are what scientists are trying to strive for whenever they genetically modify these crops. So we're able to have a higher yield. And that's a common thing that you're going to see in the Green Revolution, is the fact that we as humans are trying to get the most food that we possibly can. So the first way that we are trying to do this is through genetically modified plants. The problem with genetically modified plants is typically farmers will get one type of genetically modified plant and grow one type of crop. Why might that be a problem, growing only one kind of crop? Anybody in the chat that might have an idea? Disease, yeah. So if we have a disease that infects one of the plants, then all of them are gone. And that actually ties into the next point, biodiversity. If we only have one crop, then there's not as much biodiversity in, I guess you can call it the ecosystem or environment around the crops themselves. So we have lower biodiversity because we only have one type of crop, which makes them more susceptible to disease, as well as I'm trying to think, invasive species. And also yes, that's another impact. Pests, yes, that can those are all great answers. Again, yes, if we're growing only one type of crop, for example, corn uses a lot of nutrients. So if we have a whole bunch of corn and no other plants that are putting nutrients back into the soil, we have a problem there. And as well as pests. Yes. Again, that's like disease. They can wipe out the entire crop field. But then we also have another thing. And then people genetically modify it and try to get rid of those diseases and pests that are still trying to eat their crop. So it's, again, a cycle. So we have less food, and back on to what I was saying previously. So we have less food sustainability. So now we have just one kind of crop that we keep growing over and over and over again. And that's not a great way of having a sustainable food system if we're focusing all of our energy on one type of food rather than growing a various kind of food. And that's something that we see in the transition from traditional, and where we were going, we might have grown corn, squash, and all these different types of plants that actually work together and sort of kind of keep the farm environment alive rather than just growing genetically modified corn or other crops. And then one thing that might not impact the environment but impacts us personally is the effect of GMOs on humans isn't really known, which can be a big problem. We don't really know what happens if we eat them. So far, nothing bad has happened, but you never know. One day we might reach a breaking point where it starts we try to edit the genes so much that it negatively impacts us. So just some things to think about there. All right. So another thing that comes with the Green Revolution is higher inputs to get higher crop yields. Okay. So the thing about the Green Revolution is, like I said, humans are trying to get the most they can. They're trying to get the most food possible. Many farmers don't care about the environment. They're not trying to care for it as much. They just want high crop yields. That's what they're high crop yields. I feel like I'm saying that wrong. So they start putting a lot of resources into this. One of them is fertilizers. And like Rebecca said earlier, eutrophication is going to occur in bodies around it. With excess amount of fertilizer, what is not used by the plants is now being used in water systems when it runs off. So we have algal blooms. We have bacteria is growing again. And a lot of negative impacts are happening in our water systems because of this. So thinking a little bit further, what might be a negative impact of an algal bloom in a water system? So we know that, right, we have a lot of fertilizer. It's causing algal blooms. So let's take it another step further. What impact, furthermore, can an algal bloom cause in a body of water? in the chat if you have an answer. Let me know. Contamination. Maybe. I would say yeah, because we also do have leaching of chemicals, I guess. Might count. Fertilizer is contaminating the water. Yeah, I can see that one. And that actually leads us to our next point. Yes, blocking off of sunlight to other underwater plants, definitely, because in an algal bloom, if for those of you that might not know, it's basically algae is growing very rapidly and almost covering the entire top layer of the water, resulting in the plants down below not getting sunlight, including fish and other bacteria. So, of course, underwater plants are going to start dying. And then another thing is animals are sort of kind of or organisms living underwater don't have as much oxygen anymore. So all the algae at the top is taking all of the oxygen and processing it. Meanwhile, all the bacteria, not algae, the bacteria that's growing with the algae is taking this oxygen from the fish, which might lead to fish kills. And actually, like Camille was mentioning, contamination, nitrates can contaminate groundwater. So we'll talk more about irrigation later in the slide. But whenever a farmer puts a lot of nitrates, which are used in fertilizers, into the soil, and then they flush it with water, that water drains down. So, and it keeps going down until it reaches the water table and groundwater, which can have a negative impact on us personally, because we drink groundwater. If it gets down to the water table and soaks down far enough, then that can contaminate our water system, which will require more filtering and stuff like that to get it out. So one thing that you guys might notice is like we're doing these things to the environment, but they end up impacting us. So it's sort of kind of counterproductive there. So the next part is pesticides. I'm going to admit it. I've used pesticides in my house. Everyone probably has before, to kill bugs and stuff like that. But it's used in a much larger scale in farms and stuff like that to grow crops. Like we mentioned in the previous slide, in the Green Revolution, we have the genetically modified plants that are supposed to withstand disease and weather conditions, but pest. So we invented pesticides. Many of them are synthetic, which is not good for the environment because if you think about it, we're releasing synthetic chemicals into the environment, which is never a good idea. If you learned anything from the course, releasing chemicals into the environment is never a good idea. One thing that is a big problem is, what about natural pesticides? With natural pesticides and insecticides, I would say the pro is probably the environment would probably respond better to it, because it's natural. And I guess a con would probably be the fact that insects might become genetically resistant to it. That's what I would think. Yeah. Natural is always better than synthetic, in most cases. And I actually put it there. Pests may become genetically resistant to these pesticides, which means we might not be able to get rid of them. And then we just keep making more toxic pesticides and coming up with new ones to release into the environment until we can get rid of these pests. Okay, persistence. Basically, persistence is the length of time a pesticide will stay deadly in an environment. So, someone or a farmer might spray a pesticide over their crops, and they're like, okay, that's great, the pests are dead. But that's not the end of the story. so we have dead pests, right? Because they don't disappear. So we have a dead pest that might have eaten eaten part of the crop, and now has pesticides in it. And then we have, maybe it's like a cricket, and it eats part of the crop, and then it goes, and now it has this pesticide in it, and then a fish eats it. And a fish will probably eat more than one cricket. So it's eating more of these crickets, and it's getting all this pesticide in it. And then a bird comes down and eats the fish, and now it has all those pesticides in it. So we have this idea of bioaccumulation that's happening here. So we might just have a little bit of fertilizer, pesticides that might kill a cricket, but once that builds up through the food chain, it can create very damaging results. In the chat, let me know, have any of you heard of the story between the eagles and the DDT? You guys might have talked about it in class. You have not. Okay. Okay, so some of you have, some of you haven't. For those that haven't, what happened was DDT was a pesticide that they used. Yes, harming the eagles. DDT was a pesticide that they used to kill a certain pest. I'm not sure exactly which one. But basically what would happen is, like I said, with like the crickets, the fish, and the bird, well, it accumulated over time in these organisms. So by the time the eagle ate its prey, it had built up so much of this DDT that they were unable to reproduce effectively, because their shell was so thin that they weren't able to hatch, because they would end up breaking open very easily. So that's just sort of, and now it's illegal, I'm pretty sure. There are laws restricting it, but that shows you how a farmer that might just be looking to kill some bugs or animals that are getting into his crops might have a bigger ecological impact. And I hope that sort of kind of illustrates how everything works as it comes to pesticides. And finally, we have water and irrigation. Water and irrigation can play a big role in here as well. Pesticides and fertilizers can spread through excessive use of water and irrigation. Basically, when you are planting a lot of crops, some farmers will pump water through it like nobody's business, and that is a bad idea, because too much water in a soil can be very degrading and can have significant negative impacts. Some are listed below. Waterlogging. Waterlogging occurs when the water table rises. So we keep pumping the soil full of water, and the water table's full, like max capacity. So the water just keeps building up, and this can cause flooding, and as well as I'm not sure if this is 100% correct, but it can probably cause some contamination of the water source. So that's waterlogging. Eventually it goes down, though, as stuff starts to run off. It doesn't cause a problem where the water's being distributed, but the problem is if we have all this water, where do you think it's running off to? Nearby areas. Flooding and spreading all these pesticides and fertilizers around and getting chemicals into our environment, which is not good. All right, so the next impact we have is salinization. So again, we have all this water what's the difference between waterlogging and stay dams? Okay, so waterlogging is basically, I'm not 100% sure. What is it? Stay dams or stay dam? I don't know what that is. But waterlogging isn't really like holding back the water on purpose, I guess. Waterlogging just happens whenever the water table fills up. And it just runs off. So water starts coming to the surface. I guess the other one would probably be like if you purposefully held back water, I guess. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, sorry, I don't know the answer to that question. But salinization, so again, we have all this water being pumped into the soil, and there is salts that are mixed in with this water. And whenever we have all this water running through, it soaks the soil, and then whenever it evaporates, it leaves the salts. It leaves the salts on the soil, which causes salinization. And guess what they do to fix that problem? Inject a whole bunch more water into it until all the salts dissolve. So, yeah, feedback loop again. But and then finally we have soil erosion with the high amounts of water and runoff. Topsoil is being eroded away, and runoff is carrying chemicals everywhere. Sorry, Camille, that I couldn't answer your question. Any other questions so far? I'd be happy to answer them if I can. All right, if there are no questions, I'll move on. Again, feel free to ask any questions in the chat if you'd like. This is more about fertilizers, pesticides, and then water and salinization. Okay, so step 2 of the Green Revolution is we want to get as many crops as we can grown per year. So we are planting as many kinds of crop, as much crop as we can. We want the highest amount of yield, which leads to soil degradation. When you plant a lot of vegetation in the soil, you're bound to lose nutrients unless you have unless you have plants or crops that are putting nutrients back into the soil. So that's one problem. We have nutrients that are being lost, but we also have desertification. So this is basically when the soil potential falls by at least 10%. So soil potential is the ability to grow crops and vegetation. So if we are growing tons of crops all the time, and we'll just keep growing crops, and then all the water's gone because plants are using up this water, and then furthermore, they're using the nutrients that are in the soil. This may also be caused by other things: drought, human activity, and deforestation, like we talked about earlier, clear cutting, which is bad. So basically the soil gets really dry, or basically loses potential, gets drier, and loses its nutrients. But the soil potential can fall way more than 10%, sometimes above 70%, which is a major desertification. All right. And then finally, for the Green Revolution is mechanization. So instead of doing things by horse and carriage, and horses and buggies and all the different kinds of technology that came from that, now we're going to use mechanization. Here we see tractors, plows, all different kinds of technology that's coming from this. If you can think of any more kinds of machines that help at farming that I didn't mention, please feel free to list them in the chat. So one benefit of mechanization is increased productivity. So now humans are able to do more. And the goal of this Green Revolution is to produce more food. So if humans are able to be more productive, then we're reaching our goal, right? However, it's not all good. Some of the negatives is the running of fossil fuels, which ultimately leads to carbon emissions, which again impact our climate, which impact how the crops grow. And then we have soil compaction. So now we have these vehicles and tractors and trailers that are driving over this soil and end up compacting it. if we think back to clear cutting and we have a patch in the middle of the forest, people are probably going to drive there. So those tires are compressing that soil down, which negatively impacts it. All right. Any questions about the Green Revolution? Also, at the end, we'll have some practice questions just to see what you remember, and you can ask any other questions that you have. Okay. So the impact of agricultural practices. First, we're going to talk about tilling. So tilling is the practice of basically churning up the soil so that you can get seeds into it better. If your seeds are just on the top, laying on the top, they're less likely to grow. Birds are going to come eat them, and not many crops are going to be grown. So that farmers till the soil so that the seeds fall. That's a picture there of soil being tilled, and that's an example of mechanization, machines doing the work or the hard work. I don't know. So this is a really big one. The really big one for this is soil, and you sort of see that connection there. We're churning up the soil, we're messing with soil, so soil problems. One, plowed soil can more easily erode. So what might have been a more solid piece of soil is now being churned up. So if we have rain or any flooding that happens, then the topsoil is likely to erode, which is bad. Topsoil is what keeps the plants alive, is what holds a lot of nutrients. So once that is running off, we might see less nutrients in the soil. And that leads us into number 2. Nutrients can more easily be leached out of soil. So if we're churning this stuff up, we're loosening it up. So it might have been more compact, but now we're loosening it up, and water is more easily to flow and filter through and take these chemicals with it. But however, there is an alternative, no-till farming, which is basically where farmers, they don't till the soil, but they use alternative methods to get the seeds deeper into the soil. All right, slash and burn farming. There's actually some small environmental maybe benefit, maybe it's really a farming benefit, but slash and burn can actually cause the soil to become fertile. Ash, whenever it falls, I'm not 100% sure one method of no-till farming. I know a method that would be that is better than no-till farming. I guess it's like you till less. So like you might do like a row and then like skip a lot and then till another row. I'm not sure. But all these questions that I cannot seem to answer, if you scroll up, I put a link for all of you guys to use. It's the agricultural it says Fiveable Community for apes. If you submit your questions there, I will answer them and I will get back to you. So any questions you have after this or questions that I don't get to in the live stream, be sure to go up and respond to the topic, and I will answer them for you definitely within the next couple of days. And I'll be checking that too if you have any questions and you post them. All right, so slash and burn farming can make the soil more fertile and add nutrients. Whenever the trees are burned, the ash actually holds nutrients. So it almost creates like a topsoil that the plants can grow in. Soil loses nutrients over time though and becomes degraded because farmers, again, they're growing all these crops and which are taking up all the nutrients that the ash provided, and the trees aren't able to replenish them because they were burned out. So then we have this cycle that happens. So first we have slash and burn farming. And then we move over a little bit and we have a lot of farming and fertile soil, which is good for farmers. And then we get down here where we're basically waiting for the soil to get fertile again. and then the cycle repeats itself. Another negative impact of slash and burn farming that I didn't put is CO2 emissions, which can negatively impact the environment and climate change, which again is a feedback loop. Climate change is a feedback loop that negatively impacts the environment. All right, so any questions about the content? So I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to answer some of your questions tonight. We still have some practice questions after this. But any questions before we dive into those? All right, I guess we'll move on to the practice. All right, so as I read them, feel free to answer them in the chat. And we're just here learning together, I guess, so don't be afraid or nervous to respond. So question 1, what might be a potential benefit of slash and burn farming over clear cutting? In the chat, feel free to respond. And then if you are working on a response, they don't have to be long. Maybe a word or two. Yes, Rebecca is right. We have increased nutrients in the soil. Whenever we clear cut, remember we're not adding anything to the soil. We're cutting it all down. We're taking the trees out of there, so they're not rotting and providing nutrients because they're gone. We took them for paper. But with slash and burn farming, we have the ash, which is providing nutrients to the soil. All right, number 2. If a farmer uses fertilizer, what might happen to local bodies of water? All right, contamination. Yes, as well as eutrophication. So what I want you guys to remember about fertilizer and water is eutrophication. Yes. Contamination is right because you are contaminating the water. But I want to stress to you guys eutrophication because that's a word that the College Board uses. So whenever you think of fertilizer and water, think eutrophication. But you guys are right. Unwanted nitrates get into the water, and we have algal blooms. Yes. So you guys are correct. Number 3. Yes, contamination from runoff. Yes. What is no-till farming, and how might this method of farming help the environment? All right. Any answers coming through? Going once, going twice. Yes. So not turning up the soil. Yeah, basically not turning up the soil for farming. That's what no-till farming is. And then how might this method of farming help the environment? Can help reduce soil erosion. So we're not having the topsoil erode off and leave the land that was cleared with nothing to grow on. Number 4, what are the environmental impacts of growing genetically modified crops? Anybody? Increase use of pesticides. Okay, so yeah, I would go with Hannah's answer. Yes, we're lowering biodiversity. Yeah, not necessarily pesticides. Because something to remember is that typically genetically modified crops are genetically modified to survive a pest or disease or climate. Yeah. So, yep, we have lower biodiversity, which leads to lower food sustainability, and it can be helpful to be pest and disease resistant. Yes. So, what is it? So, good job on that question. Number 5. What does monoculture mean? Yes. Only planting one type of crop, which in turn lowers biodiversity, um, like the previous question. Um, so remember, it's better to grow more crops or more kinds of crops so that we have better food sustainability. And finally, our last question, how might the fish in a stream be impacted by deforestation? Yes, not getting enough oxygen. Um, we have soil getting into the water, so that it makes it harder for them to breathe. Water temperatures going up. We have bacteria and parasites that are growing in the water. All these things are negative impacts that might impact a fish in a stream after deforestation. Deforestation. All right. So I hope you guys learned something tonight. That's it from me. If you guys have any questions, let me know. Hold on. I'm going to copy and paste this. Hold on. I clicked on something and now it's not working right. I can't see the chat. It's really frustrating. Hold on, guys. Let me get this back up. All right, got it. I typed up this really long thing and then it went, I accidentally pasted it into the chat and now it won't let me see anything. Hold on. I'm getting there. All right. Is there a term for materials getting into the water or is it just contamination? Eutrophication. That's what it's called. Basically, it is when nutrients get into water and it causes the water to sort of kind of be over nutrified, I guess. Too much nutrients, basically. This happens in a lot of situations. Eutrophication. Even when we use fertilizers in gardens at our home, whenever it gets into the drainage ditch, it can go to bodies of water as well. And usually the impacts are the same. You have more bacteria and algae growth. Yeah. Does that answer your question? And then for chemicals getting into the water, usually you would just use contamination. Yes. All right. Sounds good. Okay. So if you guys, I'm just going to mention this one more time before I head off. If there's any more questions, feel free to type them. If you scroll all the way up, there are resources there, the APCED, to tell you exactly what you need to know about agricultural practices and anything. It lays out everything by unit. So if there's something like, oh, what do I need to know about soil? It'll tell you everything there. And then the link to these slides, maybe you want to show your friend because they're cool and have a lot of information on them, then you can share that there. And also there's a community page, which I encourage you to use. All the live streams that happen on Fiveable are a topic, and you can comment on them, any questions you have, and either a streamer, a student streamer like me, or a teacher, a verified teacher will respond to your question. So that is it. Any more questions? All right, I'm going to say there's no more questions. Well, all right, guys, thank you so much for being. I hope you guys have a great night, and I wish you the best of luck in your AP Environmental Science class, and see you hopefully in a later live stream. Thank you.